So I'm going to hand over to our student presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Hi, my name is Leah.
I'm
and I'm one of the presenters.
I'm Abigail.
And today for our presentation, we're going to be discussing the topic of discrimination.
So in their shoes, combating discrimination locally to make an impact globally. It is a known fact that over the month of June 2020, there have been several protests pertaining to the Black Lives Matter movement. This is a movement that got wider attention in the United States due to the unjust killing of a man named George Floyd and systemic racism. However, we came to a quick realization that the United States is not the only nation with systemic discrimination and racism issues. It occurs in all countries, some more covertly present than others. This initiative was taken due to the fact that acting locally, we believe, is the best way to achieve the greatest impact on a larger scale, or globally. Globalization and technology has allowed us, as well as provided us with the responsibility to raise a greater awareness, spread information faster, and take according action. So this is why we created the workshop In Their Shoes, Combating Discrimination Locally to Make an Impact Globally.
Okay, so everyone in attendance should have had a link sent to their email sometime before this workshop. So if you guys could all just access that link now, open it up. While you're doing that, I'll just explain what the link is. So once you open it, you will see a bingo with numbers on it. If you don't know how to play bingo, just a quick explainer. Basically, I will just read out some numbers. And if you hear a number that is on your bingo card, click on that number and an X will appear. It will cross that number off. If you get all of the numbers in a row are crossed off, then either put it in the chat or you can say it out loud, depending on what you're comfortable with. You just say bingo and we'll stop the game. We're going to just give you an extra minute to access the link. If you've accessed, can you just let us know in the chat so I know roughly how many people have accessed it? You'd only need the one row. Once you've crossed one row out, then that's when you say bingo. Okay, it looks like quite a few people have got it, so I think we should get started now. We don't want to be waiting too long. So the first number is number 44. The second number is 40. The third number is 70. Next is 38. Following that is 74. After that, we have 14. Now 36. 30. 80. 56. 4. 48. 34. 28. 92. 96. 22. 100. 8. 16. 94. 20. 46. 24. 54. 88. 10. 78. 84. And we have someone with bingo. Okay, very good job. Oh, I'm from Singapore too. Right, so we now have somebody with bingo, and if you, oh, 2 people. So if you would like to, could you please just put in the chat how many numbers you've crossed off? Not what numbers, just how many. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Right, so if you actually look at the chat right now, you might notice some disparities in how many numbers different people have ticked off. Some people have 1, whereas some have 15, some have 10, whereas some has 3. There's actually a very good reason for, oh, someone even has 0. There's actually a very good reason for this. Unknown to you, you did not all receive the same link. You've actually been split into 2 groups and you each received a different link. Those with the things like 16, 15, 14, you received a link and you are in group number 2, whereas people who have 1, 0, and 3 are in group number 1.
Now, notice how a specific group, which was defined by the link you were sent, which was either 1 or 2, has a significantly greater amount of numbers marked off. Although both groups had some numbers in common, the majority of the numbers were included on just one group's cards. This is because we manufactured the game in a way that favors a certain group, and there was nothing you could do to change that. You didn't even know that the links were different. This mimics the opportunities that a certain group of people have access to because of their preconceived or irreversible circumstances. Privilege, which in this case was given to those who either won or had a large amount of numbers ticked off, is decided the moment you were born and arguably even before. Factors such as race, ethnicity, gender, location are things that impact the privilege that you have access to.
Right, so before we get into the actual presentation itself, I'm just going to quickly go over a couple of general keywords and definitions that are important for you to understand. The reason that I'm doing this is a lot of these words are often used interchangeably when they should not, sorry, when they should not be. So the meaning of these words dramatically changes the meaning of the sentence or the context in which you're saying them. So the first 3 words we're going to look at are discrimination, prejudice, and racism. So discrimination, as you can see here, is defined as an unjust or prejudicial way of treating different categories of individuals, particularly based on things like race, religion, age, and sex. Prejudice is a preconceived opinion of another person based upon a particular quality. And racism is a belief that race results in particular traits, and as a result of this, some races are superior to others. Now, as you can see, there are major differences between each of these 3 words. Discrimination refers to a variety of things like race, religion, age, and sex, whereas racism just refers specifically to race. The difference between discrimination and prejudice is that prejudice is more of an opinion, whereas discrimination refers more to actions. The next 2 words that are used interchangeably when they should not be are race and ethnicity. So race refers to the common physical aspects of belonging to a particular racial group, such as having white skin, whereas ethnicity is used to refer to the cultural or social aspect. So we just wanted to highlight that these words are very different.
Now that we've covered some more general keywords and definitions, here are 3 keywords that are more specific to the topics that we were going to be discussing today, and these are the 3 different forms of racism. So the first one is interpersonal racism, which can occur between individuals. This ranges from just stigmatization all the way to physical abuse. Second, we have institutional racism, which operates through institutions such as in education. So for example, in a school or in a university, the job market, or the media. Finally, we have systemic racism, which is the culmination of the aforementioned problems. This racism is designed to systemically disadvantage people. The case studies that we are going to be presenting today are focusing on different forms of discrimination occurring all around the world. The reason why we wanted to do this, like Leah previously mentioned, is that it has occurred to us that discrimination isn't an issue that exists just in the US. Just because that is the country that is receiving the most media attention at the moment, it doesn't mean that these problems aren't occurring all around the world. Therefore, each of us have chosen one case study from where we're from to show you how global this issue really is. We also do understand that some conflicting opinions may arise given the sensitive nature of the topic at hand. Although we have tried to keep the case studies as factual as possible, we understand that some of your opinions may differ. Therefore, we do encourage you to share your opinion. However, we do expect that it is done as respectfully as possible.
Okay, so the first case study we have is from my home country, Britain, and it is known as the Windrush scandal. So just very quickly before we get it, the Windrush scandal is a scandal that occurred in 2018, and it relates to the denial of rights and the forcible deportation of primarily Black legal Caribbean migrants. So if we move to the next slide, there are some specialized keywords and definitions that you need to understand about this case study in particular. So firstly, Windrush generation. So the Windrush generation is a generation of primarily Black migrants that traveled mainly from the Caribbean to Britain in order to rebuild it after the Second World War. These are the people that we're going to be talking about today, the Windrush generation and their descendants. Hostile environment. Hostile environment is a governmental policy put in place by the British government that intended to push out illegal immigrants by making it as hard as possible for them to stay in Britain. And thirdly, institutional racism. Now, I know Avni has already given you a general definition, but this is important to this case study because this is the British definition that is recognized by the British government. So in this case study in particular, we will be judging it by this definition of institutional racism, which is the collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their color, culture, or ethnic origin. Okay. So to have an understanding of the Windrush scandal as a whole, we need to start way back in 1948. So in 1948, Caribbean people are encouraged to migrate to the UK following World War II. These people are called the Windrush generation after the Empire Windrush, which was the first ship that conveyed these migrants. A picture of the Empire Windrush is shown here. As the Caribbean was at the time part of the British Empire, the Caribbean people needed no papers to live in Britain. They could just move there as they were moving from one part of the British Empire to another. However, no protections are put in place for these primarily Black migrants, which resulted in rampant racism and discrimination against them. So now we're just going to skip forward to the 1970s. So this policy of encouraging Caribbean people to move to the UK to help rebuild it has continued. But what has changed is that more countries are beginning to gain independence from the British Empire. This means that legislation is put in place to limit the rights of new migrants. This is because these new migrants are no longer moving from one place in the British Empire to another, but they're moving into the British Empire from a foreign country. Minimal legislation is put in place to protect the status of existing migrants who are the Windrush generation, which means they don't really have that many protections. But the reason that this minimal legislation is put into place is that the Windrush generation was not required to get any papers when they moved into Britain. And with this new protection, they didn't need any papers either. However, signs like this one shown here were still common at the time due to a lack of protection against discrimination and racism. Despite the minimal legislation that I mentioned a minute ago being put in place to protect the Windrush generation, this is actually where the Windrush problem begins. Former Caribbeans who should legally be British are now being denied access to British services due to their Caribbean origins and the fact that they don't have papers. The government pays no attention to this plight, and it takes no steps past the minimal legislation that I mentioned previously. We're going to move forward to 2012 now. So in 2012, Theresa May, who was Home Secretary of England at the time, institutes the Hostile Environment Policy. through various legislative pieces to make it difficult for illegal immigrants to live in Britain. It does this by making it a legal requirement that you must have papers in order to access British services such as health and education, and to hold a job or to have lodgings. It also resulted in public campaigns such as this van, which was intended to deter illegal immigrants from staying in Britain. It is important to note that this policy does not create the Windrush problem, but it does make it much, much worse. Now the government is actively going after migrants that they have deemed illegal, such as the Windrush generation, and they've made it a legal requirement that they are denied services, but they have put no additional protections in place for the Windrush generation and their descendants. In the rest of the 2010s, actually specifically in 2014, all remaining protections for the Windrush generation are quietly removed without any debate or public knowledge. This means that the minimal legislation put in place in the 1970s is no more. The issue is that the government has tightened legislation in the 1970s and after that as well, and now they are actively going after the Windrush generation as they have deemed them illegal, despite them being completely in compliance with the law at the time when they moved. The Windrush generation doesn't have the papers that the British government require, as when they migrated, it was not required. This means that legal migrants are fired, kicked out of their houses, denied medical care, and forcibly deported by the British government due to their Caribbean origin. I believe that it is important to not just focus on the big picture, but to also remember the individuals that these issues impact. So the man pictured here is Ken Morgan, who was impacted by this scandal. His passport was confiscated when he was returning home to Britain after visiting Jamaica, which left him stranded with no money, no home, no passport in a foreign country. This did happen prior to the hostile environment policy, but it's the exact kind of problem that the policy made worse and more abundant. In 2018, this scandal breaks on a very large scale, and hundreds of people come forward about their experiences being denied medical care, being denied schooling, being kicked out of their houses, losing their jobs, and being forcibly deported. Members of the public, including the Windrush generation, and their descendants and other concerned individuals begin to protest and demand justice, as shown in this picture here. The reason for this is that these primarily Black migrants are having their lives ruined by what was later deemed to be governmental oversight. The government begins reports and schemes to rectify the scandal following public outrage. So if we just go back to Ken Morgan for a minute, Ken Morgan had his British passport confiscated in 1993 and spent the next 25 years attempting to get it back. However, once the scandal broke, the government were desperate to solve the issue in its entirety as fast as possible. And 25 years after his passport was confiscated, after 25 years of campaigning and trying to get it back, Ken Morgan was granted a visa and the promise of a passport in the future. The government also put other measures into place, which are shown in the next slide. So this slide is the action taken. Following the breaking of this scandal, action was taken not just by the government, but by the people as well. I think that it is so important to note as the action taken by the people really emphasizes the power of the individual and the power of the public. People protested, as I mentioned earlier, all over the country, and it totaled to over tens of thousands of people. There were also multiple petitions, with the highest profile one reaching over 130,000 signatures. This case also received a lot of media attention, both in Britain and around the world. All of this resulted in a variety of actions being taken, such as the Windrush Task Force, which was to locate those who were affected, the Windrush Compensation Scheme, which was to financially compensate those impacted who had lost their jobs, lost their lives, and lost their ability to stay in their home. They also commissioned Windrush Lessons Learned, which was a report to find out how the scandal occurred and how to make sure it never happened again. This report is very important, as the conclusion of this report is that both institutional racism, according to the British definition, and ignorance of race played a massive role in the denial of rights and the forcible deportation of these primarily Black Caribbean migrants. all of the action that the British government took here has been largely attributed to the media attention and to the actions of the people, which shows that local action can make significant and in some cases global change. So these articles are all taken from the Human Rights Act, specifically the British one. It is important to first note that the British Human Rights Act was actually only put into place in 1998. So at the time some of the scandal occurred, it actually did not exist. But following that, it existed, and these issues continued to occur. So firstly, we have Article 6, which is the right to a fair trial. Largely the issue was with the scandal that these people received no trial. They were forcibly deported or had their passport confiscated, or their children were not allowed into schools, or they were denied medical care, and that was it. They had no path of appeal. They had nothing that they could do about it until the scandal broke. Second of all, this Article 7, no punishment without law. Again, the law was not really involved at all. They had no path of appeal, even though they were literally legal migrants. Article 14, prohibition of discrimination. As I said, these people faced extreme discrimination and racism. Obviously, it occurred in the 1940s when they first came over, but it is occurring all the way up until today. And then there's Part 2, Article 1, protection of property. Like I said, people's homes were confiscated from them by the government because they believed they were illegal migrants. And right to education, these people and their children were denied education due to their status and their ethnic origin. Right, so it's important to note that this is not an isolated incident. This is the case I have chosen as it's very recent and it's very relevant, but there's plenty of other systemic evidence of systemic racism in Britain itself. Here's just some that I chose from, these statistics are all governmental statistics, so these are government facts. So there's racial profiling in just everyday life, like being treated as a potential shoplifter, and in terms of the police. Black people were 43 more times likely to be stopped in Britain in 2018. Black people were more than 6 times as likely to die from police shootings. This statistic is very, very important because in Britain, a lot of the police don't actually have guns. So police shootings are not as common as they are in America. So the fact that Black people are more than 6 times as likely is very, very significant. Black people also had the highest unemployment rate at 9%, which is more than twice of the British population, which was at 4%. This was in 2018. And Black and Asian women had a higher risk of dying in pregnancy, as you can see there. And this is largely attributed to ignorance in the medical system of the way that race impacts people and how they're treated. Right, as Nicola stated earlier, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and we will answer as many as we can later on. Thank you.
Now that Abby has given us an example of systemic racism in Britain, we're going to look at a more personal case or incident that occurred in Canada to Brian Sinclair. So before we get started, we're just going to look at a few specific key terms that are relevant to Canada and the case. So the first one is inquest, which is a judge ordered to collect facts relating to an incident such as death. That is not the same as an inquiry. Then in Canada, we have different levels of the government. So one of them is the provisional government, which are smaller governments set up in provinces. So they're in charge of healthcare, education, road regulations, and natural resources. Then we have the federal government, which is the main government of Canada with the parliament located in the capital city, and they're in charge of quote unquote Indian-related activities. Then we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was written in 1982, which contains the fundamental and basic rules of how the Canadian society operates. It's legally binding, and it makes up the first part of the Canadian Constitution. Then we have a triage aid, who are individuals who review medical history and take tests in a hospital to allocate the immediate care patients first. So for the specific case, the general outline of the Brian Sinclair incident is that it occurred on September 21st, 2008, where an Indigenous and handicapped man was ignored by ER healthcare workers for 34 hours and passed away for a preventable liver disease. Over here, we have an extract from a CTVN news article. So this article highlights the importance of realizing that there is a systemic problem in Canada. And the entire article pertains to the treatment of Indigenous people. So here we can see in the extract that the healthcare system, child welfare system, school, and countless more have all left Indigenous families to not trust Canada's democracy because it hasn't served them well. So in the next slide, we're going to go into history. So this is a visual of the systemic discrimination throughout the 20th century because, like Abby said, it is very important to understand the history behind these issues to get to the root of the problem and understand why it exists. So we're going to start from the right side and then go throughout the left side. So as you can see, this is a screenshot of a much larger image of discrimination pertaining to specifically Aboriginal individuals in Canada. So two things that really affected the outlook of Canadian Indigenous individuals are the Indian Act in 1876 and residential schools. So the Indian Act, first passed in 1876, was to create reserves, separate them away from society. This was to take away their political rights, such as the voting rights, as you can see is one of the examples, and took away their political decisions. Even when Canadian women got voting rights, they did not have the same status if they were Aboriginal women. And then, as you can see, it all became so that the government could control the ability of Aboriginals to pursue the land claims and take their land very easily. Now, if you look at residential schools, in this, you can see that approximately 150,000 Indigenous children were taken away from their families. And these weren't educational schools as per se, they were more of religious schools in the sense that you had to learn about the specific Christianity or religion that the individuals wanted to teach them. So the colonists knew that the children were the easiest to influence, and they took advantage of that essentially so that there could be a vicious cycle in the future to abolish the Aboriginal culture, as shown at the end of this. So this is a visual of the entire picture of why systemic discrimination exists in the Indigenous community. In the next slide, we look at health influenced by determinants, because this specific case is to do with the health systemic racism in Canada. So on the right, there is a visual which shows all of the relevant determinants to health. And furthermore, a study done by the Varsity Canada shows that colonization and racism does have the ability to influence health and socioeconomic standards. Due to the many longitudinal policies set in place, as we have seen in some examples in the slide before, it has affected Indigenous people. Dieting, parenting, and lifestyle habits take years to set in place, but once they are set, it is very hard to change. Hence, it's a multi-generational issue. So yes, a vicious cycle of health injustice does occur due to cultural deprivation and systemic isolation, as we've seen in examples like the reserves, where we're pushed aside away from the rest of society. Looking at more modern examples, we're going to look at some statistics that have been shown. So as you can see, the original arguably catalyst that started all of the systemic racism is on the left. Then on the right, we have some evidence of today. So over here, you can see a visual that Indigenous children are more likely to be in poverty than non-Indigenous children in the diagram with the map. Then you can also see that the suicide rate is higher in Indigenous communities. And something quite recent is that from an article, it says Indigenous people are at a much greater risk amid the coronavirus pandemic due to water shortages, insufficient healthcare, overcrowded housing. And you can check out that article if you're interested in reading that. So these are the official 2014 Inquest Summarised September 2008 events. So everything that occurred on that day. So at 12:51 a.m. on September 21st, 2008, Brian Sinclair was pronounced dead. So this happened as Mr. Sinclair had been transported by taxi a little earlier that day from an inner city primary healthcare facility. However, he was assessed by a physician, provided a letter from the physician, and told by that person to give the letter to an ED staff upon his arrival there. And he did speak to the triage aide, however, did not receive any assessment or treatment. So as you can see, some images of the CCTV camera over there. And due to the fact that he didn't receive any medical treatment, he died after waiting for 34 hours. Now, after that day, there was a sequence of events that followed. So over here, you can see on the timeline that on September 21st, 2008, Brian Sinclair passed away in the emergency department of the Health and Sciences Center. And in 2010, an inquest was finally launched by the police. And in 2011, the family blamed the provisional government, the people in charge of healthcare in Canada, for his death, but they said they weren't responsible. However, in 2012, the judge allows a lawsuit with some parts dismissed, specifically the systemic racism parts, due to the fact that the hospital workers did say that they treat everybody the same. So the judge didn't have any proof from any of them specifically, as stated in the inquest, that there was systemic racism in play. However, many groups, activist groups and family pull out because, as they said in that, as you can see in the quote, we believe that the legitimate concerns of many people in Winnipeg and Manitoba and across the country about Mr. Sinclair's death will not be addressed, specifically the systemic racism aspect. Then in 2014, the inquest was finalized by Mark Cormier, where there were 63 recommendations to healthcare, but because it was there was no aspects, as per se, in the inquest of systemic racism, it was not declared a homicide. So that meant none of the staff that thought he was a regular stereotype were charged at all. They left him there. There were official court documents that stated, quote unquote, that he looked drunk, or another person stated that they thought that Sinclair was, quote unquote, homeless. And there was even a security guard that stated that he looked, as I quote, sleeping it off. And so these examples are just stereotypes, but it wasn't taken into account. So none of them were charged. And there were no recommendations for systemic racism made. So according to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there were human rights abuses in this case that were violated. So Charter 7 was violated, as he was deprived of the simple right to his life and arguably the fundamental justice of his own mistreatment. And 12, he was subjected to an unfair treatment compared to the other hospital patients as he waited there for 34 hours. And 15, as there was clear discrimination, as the hospital staff created a stereotype in their heads and even said in official court documents that he was homeless and looked drunk. And 20, he did not receive any services from the hospital when he deeply needed it. 24, the enforcement clause is meant for those to make sure that their own rights are being upheld. That's why we have courts and etc. However, there was an article that mentioned that because of this, he had more rights being dead than alive. But obviously he couldn't defend himself properly, and so this case showed that there were no changes made to systemic racism. 25, it violated it as he was an Aboriginal in this case, and it did affect the outcome. And 32, as it shows, as the charter is supposed to apply to all, however, the application of the charter was not applied to Sinclair. So there were 3 major actions taken. So one was the inquest letter finalized in 2014. There were 63 recommendations and changes to healthcare. However, once again, it was criticized as there were no mentions of racism and no changes to anything in the hospitals and systems that were set in place. And they called Brian Sinclair's case, quote unquote, preventable, but not a homicide, which meant, once again, no people were charged. The second major action taken was that the OHCHR and the University of Manitoba wrote a report, Ignored to Death, Systemic Racism in the Canadian Healthcare System. They used Brian Sinclair's case to further prove their argument, and now that case is taught in Indigenous Study at Manitoba University. And the last major action taken was that by 2019, the government implemented 55 out of 63 inquest healthcare recommendations. However, nothing about systemic racism once again. So here are some solutions on different scales if you are Canadian or if you know someone Canadian. So the first one is make yourself aware, realize it is a current issue, spread knowledge, because it was stated in many of the parliaments that many individuals, many officials were unaware that this issue even exists. They think it's an issue made up by individual society. And there's a quote right below that says, it really all has to do with the blindness of privilege. People who have privilege are really, really blind to the fact that privilege plays a role in where they are today. which is why it's very, very important to make yourself educated on issues and understand others' perspectives, along with knowing your own. So another way you can help is by influencing government policies. So here are 4 government policies that could be placed to help those who live in poverty. So public policies are influenced by a variety of factors, as stated below, including public opinion and NGOs, interest groups, and political activity. So you do matter. You can make a change where you are from, which is why acting locally is a very effective way. And to make yourself educated, here are a few resources you can check out. The first one is about the Inquest documentation, everything from like the official library. The next one is a website dedicated to Brian Sinclair called Ignored to Death Manitoba, and our very own website that we created, which is called Local Action Global C. Once again, please leave your questions in the chat and the admin will choose the most frequently asked ones for us to discuss. Thank you.
Sorry, that was my bad. Thank you, Leah. And now we're going to move on to the final case study, which is one that occurred in my home country, which is India. Today, I'm going to be discussing the amendment of the original Citizenship Act, which occurred in December of 2019. Before we get into the case study, there are a few keywords that you may need to know just to fully understand the case, with the first one being amnesty, which is an official pardon for people who have been convicted of political offenses. Next, we have Raj, which in this case refers to British sovereignty and also means the rule of the government. Finally, we have the Indo-Pak Partition, which was the 1947 division of British India into independent states, Pakistan and India. So in order to better understand this case and why it occurred, it is important to learn about some of the background information and the pre-existing events that led to it. The amendment of the Citizenship Act occurred in December of 2019 and allowed illegal immigrants from certain religions from India's bordering countries to obtain Indian citizenship. Image 1 shows one of the many iterations of the flag India used under the British Raj, which first began in 1757, approximately 150 years after the British arrived in India, which was in August of 1608. Moving on to image 2, which shows a depiction of what the 20th century elections were expected to look like under British rule. A policy known as the 1909 Indian Councils Act was put into place to put Indian Hindus and Muslims into separate electorates in local elections, and this ended up being the first form of active segregation between the two religions. We move on to image 3. We can see a map which shows part of India and Pakistan, where the 1947 partition divided British India into 2 independent states, which was the Union of India and the Dominion of Pakistan, which are today known as the Republic of India and the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Hostility between the two countries rose due to the war that broke out as a result of the partition, and Hindus and Muslims were essentially a piece of land to fight for. Moving forward to 1955, the original Citizenship Act was passed. Illegal immigrants were now prohibited from becoming Indian citizens and would be deported or jailed if they were found. The law also stated that individuals must have lived in India or worked for the federal government for a minimum of 11 years before applying for citizenship. Finally, moving forward to 2019, when this incident occurred, the original Citizenship Act was amended to allow illegal immigrants from bordering countries of certain religions, which were limited to Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism, Christianity, and Parsi religion, to obtain Indian citizenship. Muslims, which was the most prominent religion in 3 of India's neighboring countries, were denied of this amnesty. Image 5 depicts the riots and protests that took place as a result of this amendment being passed, and because of these protests, lives were lost. So in terms of the parties impacted, the main party facing discrimination through the amendment of this act was those of Muslim belief in India and 3 of India's neighboring countries, which were Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. India's long-standing battle between Hinduism and Islam, which was fueled by their 20th century political segregation, and then again by the Indo-Pak partition, led to those of Muslim belief to be discriminated against despite the laws aimed to facilitate straightforward and legal migration and citizenship. This led to protests, as I previously mentioned, to break out all over India, with the law being dubbed as anti-Muslim. This caused controversy to arise as the constitution's prohibition of religious discrimination was questioned. It is important to note that there are some alternative opinions when it comes to this topic, and therefore I would just like to quickly share a couple of those. Some sources do believe the amendment of this bill is fair to exclude those of Muslim religion because the most prominent religion in 3 of the neighboring countries is Islam, and the bill seeks to provide asylum for those part of minor religious beliefs at risk of being targeted or harassed for conversion to the main religion. And then it was also formed under the assumption that Muslims will not face prosecution or harassment in countries following Islam, but those part of religious minorities are at higher risk of these consequences. Moving forward to the human rights violations, although the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not legally binding, these articles have been chosen to explain exactly why this amendment is a form of discrimination. These are solely used for explanatory purposes. So the first article that this violates is Article 1, which states that all human beings are born free and equal. Through the introduction of this law, or rather the amendment of the original law, religion is now dictating the opportunities that a certain group of people have access to, and this impacts their equality because other citizens of their countries are being able to seek refuge in India and potentially gain Indian citizenship. Next, we have Article 14, which states that everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. The bill disregards any reasoning for the need of refuge, such as political disagreement, and uses religion solely as a deciding factor in whether people are able to seek refuge if needed. Finally, we have Article 18, which states that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. By excluding Muslims from the amendment of the Citizenship Act, their right to believe in Islam is essentially being stripped as they are unable to seek refuge in India due to it. They're given an ultimatum whether they want to potentially seek safer living conditions or continue following their religion. Once again, if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat and we'll be more than happy to discuss them.
So these are a summary of simple ways that you can take action. So the first one, holistically, for all of these topics and acting locally, is to become educated. Many individuals do not have the knowledge on a variety of topics, and this can lead to false or misinformation or inaction in general, which does not solve the problem. And then if you do have the knowledge, then you can change the system, as many democratic government policies are influenced by the people from the country and public opinions.
Given that a lot of us are at home at the moment, this is the perfect opportunity for us to take action, which is the aim of this workshop, to take action locally to make an impact globally. Some of the ways that this can be done is through signing petitions, donating, educating yourself, as Leah just mentioned, and we would also like to encourage you to visit our very own website. The link will be put in the chat shortly, and this website not only aims to educate you, but you can also donate and sign petitions and even write some articles. You can contact us on the website under the Join Us tab, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Please let us know what your name is, your email, and the topic that you would wish to write an article for on our website. I'm now going to show you what the actual website looks like, just so that you can be a little bit more familiar with it. So when you open it up, this is the page that it shows. If you scroll down, you can read a little bit about how and why we chose to make this website and do this workshop. And then this is what the Join Us tab looks like. If you look at the top over here, we have quite a few different sections, one of them being the Things to Know section, and we aim to write articles or have articles on here that just help educate people on the issue of discrimination as a whole, as well as some other issues as we continue to grow. So this is one article that has been written by Leah. She has very concisely explained what systemic discrimination is, the branches of it, and much more very useful information to help educate yourself. We also have a tab called Black Lives Matter, which has an article written by Abigail on, I'm sure many of you know the case of Breonna Taylor, and Abigail has she in a lot of detail has described the events that occurred, who Breonna was, why it was injustice, and why it was discrimination. As we said, there are some petition and donation links as well. So far we have 3 causes that we have linked petitions and just general ways to take action, and please do visit this if you want to donate. And some of these links also have additional resources that you can use. And there is also a tab if you want to learn just more about us as presenters, and we want to thank you for tuning into our presentation today. We really do appreciate you taking the time to come here and listen to us speak.
Thank you, Leah, Avni, and Abigail. Officially, this session has finished. We've run out of time, but I do not have a session in this room now. So I am happy to leave this room open a little bit longer if anybody has any questions. Obviously, if you do need to leave and join another session, please feel free to do that as well. So if we want to move to the chat, and my admin team, will you be monitoring the questions and calling people out, please?
Okay, so I've got some questions here that were asked. I think I can just tackle. So firstly, the first question is to clarify, the Windrush generation initially didn't need papers to move because the Caribbean was part of the British Empire, but after it gained independence, these migrants were regarded as illegal. Basically, yes, it didn't happen immediately. It was just a general process as they tightened legislation and reduce the rights of these migrants. But yes, in the end of it, they were regarded as illegal, even though they had completely followed the law to come to Britain. The second question is a little more controversial. Do you guys think that it is okay to become violent in protest and destroy things to prove your point and gain attention so change can happen? Now, obviously, this is my personal opinion. You're free to disagree with this. My opinion is that there is too much focus currently being given to an admittedly violent minority of protesters and not enough focus on the injustice that are causing the protests. And I think people focusing on this are distracting from the real issue, which is systemic racism and discrimination globally.
Abigail, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 minute. Could everyone just switch on their cameras for a sec, just so I can take a screenshot whilst Abigail continues with questions, please? Oh, look wonderful. Abigail, feel free to continue. Everyone just keep smiling nicely.
Do you guys have the questions about your case studies?
Yeah, okay, so for my case study, I think the first question is, many Indigenous societies are deprived of their education and literacy. How could we help voice their demands? So education and literacy are kind of mixed together. And so this all relates to the government policies. And once again, in order to change government policies, public opinion has to change. So essentially what needs to happen is lobbying, and through activism, lobbying occurs. So I think that's how we can help voice their demands. And another one is, if the charter was violated, do you feel that Sinclair's family should have been offered support, perhaps financially? So the court did give Sinclair's family $110,000 for damages, but said that there were no mentions of systemic racism in the entire case, which is what they were actually fighting for. And I think that's all the questions for me.
Okay, so one of the questions that I had for my case study is that, as we know that Muslims are treated horribly in India due to the president, how can we change this? I think something that we've mentioned throughout our presentation, I'd really like to emphasize on, is that there is nothing stronger than the voice of the public. Signing petitions and making your voice heard, not only by speaking on platforms in the internet, but educating your family members and friends is one of the biggest ways that you can make a change. So just telling people and showing them how they can help and make the world a better place, I think that's one of the best ways you can change discrimination in any circumstance. And I've also been asked that if there are any statistics that I've found to give, to take a look at the demographics of the people who seek asylum in India. I do have this information, and if you would like to see it, I'd love for you to go onto our website and just let me know if, under the Join Us tab, and I'll be sure to communicate with you on that.
Well, thank you for listening, everyone, and thanks for your questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming.
Okay, so there's no more questions. I'd like to thank Leah, Avni and Abigail for their very interesting presentation and for giving us their time. And I hope to see everyone in a future session. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.